Okay, so let's now create our first GUI app. In the last video, you may remember that I said there are 4 stages to creating any tkinter app. We first of all need to import the tkinter library. So let's go ahead and complete step 1. So we can put from tkinter, we are then going to import and then put an asterisk, which we know means all. So import all from tkinter. And that's step 1 complete. On to step 2. We then need to create the main window for the application. So the way we're going to do this is by creating a variable, and it's common practice to call this variable root, and we will set this equal to tk with parentheses, where the T is a capital letter. And you can see here, if I look at the documentation, the docstring tells us that this is going to create the top level widget of tk, which represents mostly the main window of the application. And this is all we need to do for step 2. We've now created the main window of the application. And you may be thinking this sounds too easy, but no, this is how simple it is. Now the third step I mentioned was to then add the widgets to the application depending on your program's needs, and we'll touch on this very shortly because I'm going to skip to the 4th part where we just run our application. To do this, I simply need to call upon the main loop method on this tk object. And you can see here, if I look at the docstring, we're simply presented with the sentence, call the main loop of tk, which essentially means run the program. So if I execute the main loop, you can see that we're presented with a star, which basically means that the program is running, and it will continue running until we close out of the application. And if I drag across the application that we've created, you can see our application window here. So we have the title of the app, which is defaulted to tk. We have a window that we can resize. We can minimize this window, we can maximize this window, and we can also close this window. So for the time being, I'm simply going to close this window by clicking on the X in the top right. Now you can see that when I do this, the main loop code cell changes from a star to the number 3 because we've broken out of that main loop by closing the application. Now admittedly, this application isn't very exciting because it doesn't do anything. But we're now going to fill the application with lots of logic in the upcoming videos in this section. And the first thing we're going to do is change the title of the application. The current name of tk isn't really exciting, so to do this, all I need to do is type root and then a dot, so using dot notation. We can dive into the objects, attributes and methods, and if I scroll down, you can see there's so much we can do with this tk object. And one of the things we can do is select the title method. If I look at the documentation of the title method, you can see here that we're able to set the title of this widget by providing a string inside the parentheses. So I'm going to label our application our first GUI app. When I rerun the main loop code cell, you can see that the title of our application window has now changed to our first GUI app. So depending on what string you put in the title method, your application will change names accordingly. In the next video, we're going to build up this GUI by looking at different widgets that we can add to our application. In the last video, we created a very basic app, and in this video, we're going to start making it a little bit more exciting. We're going to add widgets to our application. So just to recap, we first of all imported tkinter. We then created a tk object and we labeled this as root. We then changed the title of our app by calling upon the title method. And just to improve the main app window's layout, I'm also going to call upon the geometry method, which will allow us to resize the main app window. So I can put root.geometry, and then inside the parentheses, I can pass in the width and height as a string. So I'll put 500 x 500. And you'll see how this resizes the main app window when we run the program. You can then see we have an empty space for the main app logic, which is where we'll be including our widgets, and the 4th section is where we run the app's main loop, written as root.mainLoop with parentheses. So let's now start populating our main app logic. And for the purposes of this demonstration, I'm simply going to include some random buttons on the app. Now it's important to note that widgets in tkinter are objects. They are essentially instances of classes that represent the specific widget of choice. So we'll create an instance of a button class by first of all calling the instance button1 and setting this equal to a call on the button class, so we'll put button, and then inside parentheses we're able to populate numerous properties that help us design the button in the way that we want to see it in our program. Now you will notice that when I take a look at the documentation of the button class, we have some standard options. So we can set the background, the border width, the font, we can put some text, we can set some standard options. And I'll attach some documentation in the resources section where you can read about what these options will provide you. And if I scroll further down, you'll also then see some widget specific options that we can set. So we have command, we have state, and these options are specific to the button. So command, for example, will enable us to execute a function of choice when we click on the button. And we'll see how this works shortly. So inside the parentheses, we first of all need to put root, which will act as the master parameter, which represents the parent window that we're working in. So root will usually be the first argument that you pass into your widgets. We can then put a comma, and then we can now set the properties for this button. So first of all, we'll set the property called text to equal click me with an exclamation mark. We'll then set a property called BD, which stands for border, and we'll set this equal to 5 pixels. We'll set the height of the button to be equal to 10. We'll set the width of the button to be equal to 20. We'll change the font of click me to be Arial. We'll give the button a background, so BG, and we'll set this equal to light blue as a string. And then finally we'll set a command so that when we click on this button, the application window closes. And the way we can do this is by setting command to equal root.destroy. And it's that destroy method which will essentially close the application as if you were clicking the close button in the top right hand corner. We then need to choose where we're going to place this button, and for the time being we're simply going to put button1.pack with parentheses. And what this will do is just place the button inside the window where it can, depending on what you have in the application. And we'll take a detailed look at widget geometry management in the next video, where we can see how we can control exactly where we place these buttons within the application. But for now, we're simply going to call upon the pack method, which will literally just pack all the widgets one after the other in the window. So let's run this code cell and then the app main loop. And as you can see, when the application loads, we get a button presented at the top in the center because we've used that .pack method, and we have a button that says click me. The background is light blue, the font is Arial, we do have a border that we can see, it says click me, and if I click on the button but don't release the button, you can see that the button looks like it's being pressed, so we've got some graphics here as well. And when I let go of the button click, the application closes because the command that's associated with this button is root.destroy, and that will close the application accordingly. So it's very easy to place a widget in an app. We simply create an instance of the specific widget class that we want in the app. We then associate it with the parent window, which in our case is that root TK object. And then we set the properties, things like text, background color, height, however you want to design it. Let's quickly add another button and pack it underneath. So we'll call this button button2, and we'll set this equal to a call on the button class. The first parameter will be root. We'll then put a comma. We'll have the text to equal click me first with an exclamation mark. And you'll notice that we have another widget specific option known as state, and we're able to set this to active, disabled or normal depending on what your use case requires. So for the purposes of this example, I'm actually going to set the state of this button initially to be disabled. Now theoretically I could put this in a variable and set the variable equal to disabled, and depending on what users click, maybe I then change it to normal or change it to active, but here I will simply hardcode to disabled, so a user will never be able to use this button. I will then put a command that's associated with this button to be the same as button 1, so we'll put root.destroy. I'll simply then pack the button into the application, so I'll put button2.pack with parentheses. And when I run the application, you can see that we still have our original button, which we formatted in this way, and then we have a second button underneath, which does have the text click me first. It then has all the default formatting, but we've set the state to equal disabled. So you can see that when I try clicking on this click me first button, nothing happens. So we're not actually closing the application, even though we've set the command to equal the destroy method for this button. Now if we start thinking ahead, once we've learned how to place these buttons exactly where we want within the application, and once we've been introduced to a label that enables us to see text presented to the screen, we're very close to being able to reconstruct a calculator application. And that's exactly what we're going to try. But before we do, let's just quickly visit how we can be more specific with our placements of our widgets. So I'll see you in the next video. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at how we can execute functions inside of a GUI application. Now, simply placing widgets in an application would not lead to a very exciting program. We want things like buttons to perform some kind of function when it is clicked. So let's see how we can link an event such as a click of a button to then call upon a function that then performs some kind of operation. So first of all, we'll create an application so that when you click on a button, a message box appears congratulating you for clicking the button. Not very exciting, but understanding the concept is the most important thing here. So first of all, we're going to import tkinter, so we can put from tkinter import star. And we are also going to specifically utilize the message box functionality, so we're also going to put from tkinter import message box, so we can now use message box and access the methods available on this object. We'll then create our main window, so we can put root equals tk, and we'll set the size of this application window, so root.geometry, to be 200 by 100. Okay, so simple so far. Let's now add a button to the application. So we can create a variable called button, and we can set this equal to a call on the button class, and we'll pass in root as the first argument, and the text of the button will simply be click. For simplicity, we'll then just pack the button into the application, so we can put button.pack with parentheses, and then we can put root.mainLoop with parentheses at the end. When we run this simple application, you can see that we get a button in the application window with the text click, but when I click on this button, nothing happens. So how do we call a function or some form of action once the button is clicked? Well, the way we do this is by defining a function inside the application. And one of the most important things to remember here is that we need to define the function before the button definition. So let me say that again, we need to place our function before the button definition. So let's go and create this function. So above this instance of the button, we are going to create a function that brings back a message box. So we'll call this function show message, so we'll put def show message with parentheses and then a colon, exactly the same way how we would define a normal function. I can then put message box dot and then call upon show info, and if I put parentheses and then open up the documentation, you can see that this method will show an info message, where the first parameter will be the title of the message box and the second parameter refers to the message that will be stated on screen. So for the first parameter, we'll simply put a title of message, and the second parameter will simply put nicely clicked. Now at this point, we've simply created the application window we've defined a function called showMessage, and then we've created a button that we've packed into the application. And we've given the button text saying click. But how do we link that click to the action of showing a message box? Well, this is where a widget specific option known as command will come into play. So we can put the keyword command and we can then set this equal to the function name. Now it's important here that we put the function name as it is and we don't put any quotes around it and turn it into a string. So we simply need to put show message after the equal sign. So at this point we've created a button and we've told it that when it's clicked, the command should execute the show message function. So let's run this code cell and see our application in action. You can see now that when I bring the application across and I click on the click button, we then get a message box appear which has the title message, and inside the message box we're presented with the string nicely clicked. We then get an OK button, and if I click the OK button, the message box disappears. If I once again click back on the click button, the message box appears. So we've been able to link an action upon a click of a button. Great, so let's take that example one step further. And this example will help you in the next video when we look to start building out a calculator using Python and tkinter. In the next example, what I want to do is create a counter application. So what do I mean by this? Well, when I click on a button, I want it to show on screen a counter incrementing by 1 each time. So for example, let's say that we're counting the number of people that walk into our shop. So when we click on a button, we should see that number increment on the screen by 1 each time. So how do we go about doing this? Well, once again, let's import tkinter. So from tkinter, import star. We'll create a variable called root and we'll set this equal to a call on the tk class. We'll once again set the size of the application, so we'll put root.geometry and we'll set this equal to a width of 200 and a height of 100 pixels. Now to keep things simple, the first thing I'm going to do is create a count button, so I'll create a variable called counter and I'll set this equal to a call on the button class. The first parameter will be root. We can set the text of the button to equal count, and then we will simply pack this into the application. So at this point, when I run the application, we get a simple button which says count. When we click this button, it doesn't do anything just yet, but what we do want it to do is display some information to the user, telling us how many times the count button has been clicked. So to do this, a technique that we can adopt is to utilize the entry class. So we can create a display box which we'll call text display, and we'll set this equal to a call on the entry class. We'll pass in the first argument as root, and we'll pass in a second argument for now known as justify, and we'll set this equal to the string right, with the intention that this will place any text that we put in this entry box to the right hand side of the box. We can then follow this with .pack, and in a similar way to how a calculator is presented, I'll actually move this text display box above the count button so it's easier for the user to see. Okay, so at this point, if I run the application, we're now presented with an entry box which actually can be populated with anything that you want, and when I click the count button, nothing really happens. So they're not linked in any way, and at this moment in time, it's pretty much a useless application. So now let's think of the function we're trying to perform. When we click on this count button, we want the entry box to display some text which then increments by 1 every time that the button is clicked. And the way we can do this is by creating a value holder for string variables. So let me show you what I mean. If I create a variable called text_input and set this equal to a call on the string var class and then place parentheses, you can see that when I look into the documentation, we're told that this class will allow us to create a value holder for string variables. Now the way that we can place this value holder inside of the entry box is by utilizing a parameter called text variable, and we can then set this equal to text underscore input inside of the entry box instance, which we've called text display. So we'll put text variable equals and then text input. Now we know that when the application is opened for the first time, the number of clicks that have been registered would be 0. So we'll also create a variable called total, which will set to the string 0. And the reason I'm putting the string 0 is because the text underscore input variable is a placeholder for strings. So we'll need to deal with type conversion later on in our function, but we're going to set it to a string 0 initially. We can now move on to defining our function. And where do we need to define the function? Well, we need to define the function above the button which will contain the command calling upon this function. So we'll put it underneath our variable definitions for the time being. So we'll call the function button click, and then we'll put parentheses and a colon. We will then access the total variable by utilizing the global keyword and then putting total, which means that this function specifically will change the value stored in the total variable in the global scope. So it will change everywhere where total is referenced. So when the button is clicked, we then want to set the total to equal total, which we know is a string, so we'll need to put this in the inbuilt int function, and then we want to plus 1. We then want to display this total inside the entry box, so we can then put text underscore input, and we can call upon a useful method known as set. So we can put dot set, and inside parentheses we can pass in total, which we'll need to convert back to a string, so we'll need to pass it into the built-in str function, because text underscore input is a value holder for string objects. Okay, great, so our function looks complete, but there's one thing that's missing. We haven't linked the click of a button to this function. So how do we go about doing this? Well, we can pass in the command keyword, and we can set this equal to our function name, which we've called button click. Okay, so at this point, our application should be complete. So let's run the application to see it in action. The first thing you'll notice is that we're presented with an entry box and a count button, and when I click on the count button once, a 1 appears in the entry box. If I click it again, 1 turns to 2. If I click it a few more times, you can see that we're incrementing 1 each time, and it's being presented in the entry box. So hopefully you're now starting to see how we can link an event such as a click of a button to a function call, and then display things on screen. We've picked up a couple of techniques here which will definitely help you when constructing a calculator, and that's exactly what we're going to do next. So I'll see you in the next video.